All right, guys, we are live, and I know if you clicked on this, you just want to hear this book. You don't want to hear me talk, but it's good to be back. It's been a long time, too long. But I'm down here in the basement, and I actually have two monitors going now. I'll show you real quick. I'm kind of proud of this. I had this old monitor just sitting on the shelf, and I thought, why not? Let's get some use out of it so you can see it right there. So that's what I'm working with down here below ground. So, yeah, we're gonna do that, and I wanted to use OBS, but it wouldn't work. It wouldn't connect to my YouTube for some reason. I had to change some things, so we'll keep working on that. Tonight, we're gonna use StreamYard and hopefully record this into a high quality file in GarageBand while we're streaming. I figured, hey, free publicity to live stream the recording of an audiobook. So that's what we're going to do. I've had this in the workings for a long time from my buddy, old C. Maupin, has written an incredible book telling us where America is going. So let's see if we can go ahead and jump into it. So my audio, I've got my good audio interface. I think everything is going okay. So let's go ahead and hit record on this. And that looks good. All right, let's see if it works. 1, 2, 3. Make sure that's turned off. Are we getting any audio? Yep, that looks good. We're not clipping. So we'll bump over here. Let's go to the full screen and start reading. All right, so the first thing is there's some photos in this, and I don't know exactly how I'm going to read the captions of the photos because I'm worried it will break up the flow of the text, but we'll figure it out. I don't know if I'll get to the end of the chapter and then go back to the photos maybe, but let's just read it and see how we do. All right, so we got it in the free scroll mode. Let's see if I can make it fill up more of the screen maybe for live streaming. What's it hurt? Oh, that looks nice. Yeah, about like that. All right. Where is America going? By Mr. Caleb Maupin. All right, and it is not set to free scroll. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Continuous scroll. All right. Where is America going? By Caleb Maupin. Where is America going? Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution by Caleb Maupin. This is put out by the Center for Political Innovation, dedicated to educating and fostering visions for a future beyond capitalism. So here's the contents. We've got, well, I tell you what, you can go back and look at that yourself. Let's get right into it here. All right. Chapter 1, the root of the problem. Where do profits come from? The problem of overproduction. The falling rate of profits. Where did the computer revolution come from? A long-term economic crisis. How can this crisis be solved? Ensuring economic growth. A government of action. Let's for a moment imagine self-driving cars. We have been told this great technological achievement is not very far in the future. Soon, driving may be a thing of the past, and artificial intelligence, computer sensors, and other innovations may be applied in a way that makes automobile transportation completely automated. In a rational society, this would be a cause for celebration. The amount of human labor that goes into driving could be expended elsewhere. We can move to a higher level of material abundance with one form of human labor no longer necessary. However, we do not live in a rational society. We live in a society governed by money and profits. In our highly irrational market centered economy, self driving cars would be a complete nightmare. It is a nightmare that is already hanging over us. As Andrew Yang, a New York businessman and a candidate in the 2020 Democratic Party primaries, told the New York Times, all you need is self driving cars to destabilize society. We are going to have 1 million truck drivers out of work who are 94% male with an average level of education of high school or 1 year of college. We have 5 to 10 years before truckers lose their jobs and all hell breaks loose. In the high-tech 21st century, for-profit American economy, human beings live by selling their labor power to a boss. If someone is unable to sell their labor power, they are rendered unemployed, and it becomes very difficult for them to feed, house, and clothe themselves. In a rational society, self-driving cars would be a good thing. However, in a profit-centered economy, they would lead to mass poverty and suffering. Even in the good old days of the 1950s, when the U.S. economy was booming, you still had lots of hungry stomachs in Appalachia, the rural South, and impoverished urban centers. Despite its once big, prosperous middle class, America has always had an underclass of those who often populate the prisons and the lower ranks of the military. Among this permanent underclass, there has always been a significant overrepresentation of African Americans, Chicanos, and people of color, in addition to whites. The existence of the permanent layer of impoverished workers is something that U.S. media has aimed to cover up. It is a strong argument against the image the U.S. elite seek to present of a land of unending prosperity. However, these are not normal times in America. The conditions that have always been present for some are now expanding to the bulk of the population. 60% of American workers are living paycheck to paycheck. Food banks are overwhelmed with demand. The percentage of children living in households deemed to be food insecure by the U.S. Department of Agriculture has risen. The suicide rate and the rate of deaths from alcohol poisoning and drug overdoses are rising. The infrastructure of the United States, from power plants to water treatment facilities to roads and bridges, is falling apart. The life expectancy of Americans has decreased to the lowest point in 25 years. Though the economic crisis is the basis, there is a wider cultural and spiritual crisis that has unfolded. There is a political crisis as the elite battle each other and seek to resolve the crisis with heavy-handed force. The root of this crisis can be found in economics, and this book will put forward primarily economic solutions. The economic foundations of our society must be reinvented so that all the human creativity, labor energy, and natural resources found in the vast territory of the country can be unleashed to once again create huge amounts of growth. Where do profits come from? We don't live in a society where houses are built because people need shelter. We don't live in a society where food is grown, processed, and packaged because people need to eat. We live in a society where the guiding force of production is profit. Houses are built so that landlords and banks can make money selling or renting them. Food is produced so agribusiness corporations and big box stores can make profits from sales. Apple makes iPhones, Kraft makes cheese, and every other major corporation is operated on the basis of maximizing profit for its shareholders. Profit is in command of production. The banks, the major media, the means of transportation, The oil wells, all the major players in our economy operate so that those who own them can get a return on their investment. This is the definition of capitalism. Currently, there is a great deal of confusion about capitalism. Capitalism is not a term for having money. Money existed in ancient Rome, Greece, and medieval Europe. China was printing paper money before Marco Polo ever visited this thriving civilization. Capitalism is not synonymous with money, and many non-capitalist societies have money. Capitalism is not synonymous with inequality either. There was inequality in feudalism. There was inequality in the slave civilizations of ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. There is inequality in the socialist, non-capitalist societies that exist around the world today. Capitalism, as Mao Zedong, the founder of the Chinese Revolution, defined it, is profits in command. Friedrich Engels defined it, saying, under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. Karl Marx wrote about the anarchy of production. Capitalism is the economic system we live under in the United States, and it is defined as production organized to make profit for private owners. As William Z. Foster, leader of the Great Steel Strike of 1919 in the USA, explained, the basic contradiction of capitalism, the source of all its weakness and of its final dissolution, is found in the fact that this system does not carry on production for the benefit of society as a whole, but for the profit of a relatively small owning class. The great industries by which society must live are owned by private individuals who ruthlessly exploit the masses who work in these industries. Under capitalism, production is regulated not by the needs of the masses, but by whether or not the capitalist class can make a profit by such production. Commodities are not produced primarily for use, but for profit. So, in a capitalist economy, where production is organized for the profit of private owners, how are these profits created? Where do profits come from? The truth is that profits can only come from human labor. Imagine you had a capitalist who manufactured pins. The cost of the materials to go into the pins shall be represented by A. The cost of shipping the pins shall be represented as B. The labor cost of the employees he hires shall be represented by C. The final cost of the pin, which is paid by the consumer who purchases it, shall be represented as D. A plus B plus C equals D. The cost of the pin is the combined total of the materials, shipping, and labor costs. But there is a problem. How can the capitalist who sets this up make a profit, a return on his investment? The owner cannot change how much the materials cost. A must remain untouched. The owner cannot change how much the shipping costs. B must remain untouched. The profits that the capitalist makes can only be extracted from C. It is the value put into the pin by the labor costs from which the capitalist can extract his profits. So, in order to ensure the profit is made from each pin, our equation must be corrected. A plus B plus C1 plus C2 equals D. C1 represents what the worker is actually paid in wages. C2 represents the surplus value that is extracted by the employer as profit. The problem of overproduction. This is how production is done under capitalism, and capitalism has always had a built-in problem. The cause of the boom-bust cycle, in which the market goes up and down, is this: C1 is less than D. The final cost of the pin is always significantly higher than the wages paid to the worker to produce it. If this is extrapolated throughout the entire economy, we see the problem that the wages paid out to workers who produce products is never enough to purchase the products they produce. This is called the problem of overproduction. The worker can never buy back what he produces. The market inevitably always has more products than it can sell. Karl Marx wrote about this problem of overproduction in capitalism. John Maynard Keynes, another economist, spoke of underconsumption. The result of overproduction is what economists call glut. This is a situation where the market has so many goods that prices drop, businesses close down, workers lose their jobs, and the economy experiences a downturn. The problem of overproduction and glut is a problem that only exists in capitalism. In previous societies, people were homeless because there was not enough housing, and people were hungry because there was a shortage of food. But only under capitalism are people hungry because there is too much food. Only under capitalism are people homeless because there is too much housing. Capitalism creates a problem which is deeply irrational, a problem of poverty amid plenty, or poverty created by abundance. The more wealth is created, the poorer people get. This is expressed by a famous dialogue labeled the coal miner's riddle that takes place between a father and son. Son: Father, why is it so cold? Can we turn on the stove to keep warm? Father: No, we don't have any coal to heat the stove. Son: Father, why don't we have any coal to heat the stove and keep warm? Father: Because I cannot afford it. Son: Why can't you buy any coal? Father: Because I lost my job at the coal mine. I was laid off. I am now unemployed. Son: Why did you lose your job at the coal mine? Father: Because there's too much coal. Production for profit will always have this built-in problem of overproduction. In the U.S. state of Missouri, there is a cave where 1.4 billion pounds of cheese has been buried. Why does the U.S. government purchase so much cheese? Simply to bury it in a cave. Because this keeps the price of cheese and other dairy products from dropping. It is just one artificial mechanism among many created to deal with overproduction. The governments of the world have developed all kinds of mechanisms to attempt to abet the economic turbulence created by overproduction. The U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, the various corporate subsidies that are distributed, the military-industrial complex, the food stamps program, the huge amounts of government spending on various projects are all necessary to keep the capitalist economy churning along, despite the fact that the amount of wages paid out will never be enough to purchase the products. Karl Marx wrote of this problem in 1848 when he published the Communist Manifesto. It is enough to mention the commercial crises that by their periodical return put the existence of the entire bourgeois society on its trial, each time more threateningly. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that, in all earlier epochs, would have seemed an absurdity: the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seemed to be destroyed. And why? He wrote. Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions, by which they are fettered. And so soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. Marx's close collaborator, Friedrich Engels, explained it this way. As a matter of fact, since 1825, when the first general crisis broke out, the whole industrial and commercial world, production and exchange among all civilized peoples, and their more or less barbaric hangers-on are thrown out of joint about once every 10 years. Commerce is at a standstill, the markets are glutted, products accumulate, as multitudinous as they are unsaleable, hard cash disappears, credit vanishes, factories are closed, the mass of the workers are in want of the means of subsistence because they have produced too much of the means of subsistence. Bankruptcy follows upon bankruptcy, execution upon execution. The stagnation lasts for years. Productive forces and products are wasted and destroyed wholesale until the accumulated mass of commodities finally filters off, more or less depreciated in value, until production and exchange gradually begin to move again. Little by little, the pace quickens. It becomes a trot. The industrial trot breaks into a canter. The canter, in turn, grows into the headlong gallop of a perfect steeplechase of industry, commercial credit, and speculation, which finally, after breakneck leaps, ends where it began, in the ditch of a crisis. And so, over and over again. Explaining the roots of this problem, Engels wrote, "Money, the means of circulation, becomes the hindrance to circulation. All the laws of production and circulation of commodities are turned upside down. The economic collision has reached its apogee. The mode of production is in rebellion against the mode of exchange. The whole mechanism of the capitalist mode of production breaks down under the pressure of the productive forces, its own creations. It is no longer able to turn all this mass of means of production into capital. They lie fallow, and for that very reason, the Industrial Reserve Army must also lie fallow. Means of production, means of subsistence, available laborers, all the elements of production and of general wealth are present in abundance. But abundance becomes the source of distress and want. Fourier. Because it is the very thing that prevents the transformation of the means of production and subsistence into capital. For in capitalistic society, the means of production can only function when they have undergone a preliminary transformation into capital, into the means of exploiting human labor power. The necessity of this transformation into capital of the means of production and subsistence stands like a ghost between these and the workers. It alone prevents the coming together of the material and personal levers of production. It alone forbids the means of production to function, the workers to work and live. William Z. Foster explained it this way. Naturally, a worker getting a wage of $3 to $5 a day cannot buy back the 10 to 20 or more dollars worth of commodities he has produced. This gap between his producing and buying powers widens by the constant increase in the worker's productive capacity through machinery and the speed up, and also by the lowering of their standards of living. The capitalists waste huge masses of these stolen commodities through luxurious living, by the creation of hordes of parasitic occupations, by immense military establishments and wars. They seek to dispose of them by export trade. But the surpluses are not exhausted by these means. There is an inevitable tendency to glut the market with unsaleable commodities, even though, as now, the millions of producers who make up the bulk of the population may actually starve and die for want of the barest necessities of life. The market suffers from overproduction. The falling rate of profits. However, the constantly existing problem of overproduction gets worse in certain periods. The capitalist wants to sell as many products as possible, and at the same time, He wants to pay as little in wages as he can. The capitalist is competing with other capitalists, and he is motivated to make the highest amount of profit by selling the most products. One of the main ways a capitalist can increase the amount of profit he makes by selling products is to reduce labor costs. Replacing workers with machines makes it cheaper to produce products. The less and less workers that are hired, the more profits the capitalist can make. But this also presents a new problem. Let's revisit our equation. A plus B plus C equals D. A plus B plus C1 plus C2 equals D. In our equation, C represents the value put into the product by the labor of the worker. As we can see, the profit of the capitalist is extracted by cutting into this value. The wages the worker receives are C1, and the capitalist profits are represented by C2. As the capitalist reduces labor costs by replacing workers with machines, he cuts into his own profits. The cost of the machines that replace workers are unchanging. He can only make profits from human labor. As the percentage of D, the final cost of the product that is input by C, human labor, goes down, C2 must also go down. The more efficient production becomes, the amount of profit that the capitalist can make on each product decreases. Because the capitalist is making less and less profits per item he produces, with his rate of profit decreasing, he's incentivized to produce more and more to make up for the losses. The already existing problem of overproduction becomes compounded by this problem, which is called the tendency of the rate of the profit to fall, or the falling rate of profit. With workers being paid less and less as their place at the assembly line decreases, their ability to buy products decreases. With the capitalist seeing the rate of profit he makes on each product going down, his drive to produce and sell more and more products in order to maintain his profits increases. This all leads to a situation where the market is glutted with products that cannot be sold. The worker cannot afford to buy them, and the capitalist is driven to produce more and more than ever because the amount of profit he makes on each item has decreased. In his book, The Future is Up to Us, Nelson Peary asked the question, what does robotics demand? The robots demand that their production be given away because there is no value to their production. What makes revolution absolutely inevitable is that we have a society based upon the creation of value and production that is increasingly more valueless. What is value? Value is the exchange relationship between things. This cup is worth so many tape recorders, or this pair of shoes is worth so many marbles. It is the relationship between things. Thus, if one robot is producing cups and another robot is producing tape recorders, how do you equate them? If a human being makes a cup and a human being makes a tape recorder, you can equate their relationship by how much labor time went into making the cup and how much labor time went into making the tape recorder. You can establish how many cups are worth by how many tape recorders. But if a robot makes them, how do you then establish a value relationship between them? I don't think you can. Robots can make cars, but they can't buy them. Since production is increasingly carried on without human labor, without creating value, such production cannot be distributed with money. Money expresses value. Expended labor time is the basis of exchange, and it is represented by money. If the worker doesn't work anymore and the robot creates the commodities, how is it possible to sell them? You cannot sell them. And if you don't sell them, how are you going to distribute them? In his book, High Tech, Low Pay, the Marxist writer Sam Marcy observed the same problem. Profit does not come from machinery itself. It is the labor of a worker. Workers produce a greater value than they receive back in wages, and it is the unpaid portion of their labor that produces surplus value. But a robot is not a worker. A robot is fixed or constant capital, which does not produce profit. Only unpaid human labor produces profit. Marcy goes on to explain, the individual capitalists are driven to substitute labor-saving machinery for workers because it gives them a competitive advantage. For a certain period, the capitalist who is able to utilize the new technology and lower the unit cost of his product can actually enjoy a greater profit because the market reflects a generalized cost still based on the old technology. Eventually, however, the new technology itself becomes generalized and the rate of profit falls. The advantage to a higher composition of constant capital is always temporary. Moreover, it spurs on destructive competition, in which much equipment that could still be socially useful is made prematurely obsolete. In order to compensate for the falling rate of profit, the owners are forced to increase the volume of profit. This can only be done by further increasing production. Much of the economic literature deals with the displacement of jobs as the result of the introduction of high technology, but it does not deal with the decline in the rate of profit from the long-range point of view. Technology is a double-edged sword. Furthermore, automation does not solve the problem of the capitalist contradiction that leads to economic crisis. On the contrary, it exacerbates it precisely because of the decline in the rate of profit. High technology does not produce high profits. It increases the productivity of labor, but decreases the proportion of labor used in production in relation to the amount of fixed capital. Where did the computer revolution come from? If you can understand that human labor creates all value, and how in a capitalist economy this leads to the problem of overproduction, which is then compounded by the tendency of the falling rate of profit, you can understand the crises we are in as a civilization. In 2014, many American moviegoers were entertained by a film called The Imitation Game. This was a historical drama portraying a true story about how a brilliant mathematician named Alan Turing was utilized by the British government during the Second World War to create an elaborate decoding machine. This decoding machine laid the basis for much of what has been described as the computer revolution. The film focused on Turing being unrecognized for his genius and tragically committing suicide after being forced to take medication intended to cure his homosexuality. Many have noted that the symbol of one of the biggest computer corporations of today may actually have been some kind of demented inside joke about the fact that Turing committed suicide by eating an apple he dipped in cyanide. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union invested in advancing computer technology. In 1970, Zbigniew Brzezinski, a Cold War strategist based at Columbia University, composed a book entitled Between Two Ages: America, Role in the Technotronic Era. In the book, he argued that the new left of anti-war and civil rights protesters in the United States did not pose a danger of overthrowing Western capitalism. He pointed out that the various communist groups had no real base among the population, and that the rise in protests was not so much a revolutionary movement as it was a response to changes in the culture brought on by information technology. With more access to information, people in the United States and across the world were questioning old customs and habits. The way people interacted with authority and tradition was being renegotiated, and many young people felt stifled by Cold War conformity and wanted more social liberalism. Cold War strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski developed the strategy of putting the United States at the center of the information revolution. Brzezinski argued that rather than fighting the new left, as the Nixon administration had done, the United States should embrace this wave of liberalism and rebellion wrought by the information technology. He argued that putting the United States at the center of the information technological revolution could Americanize the world. The wave of cultural confusion and anti authoritarianism that information technology created could be utilized to sow dissent and destabilize the Soviet Union and the communist countries. With control of media, art, and culture, the United States could push its system of free market capitalism and its values of radical individualism to a position of dominance in the world. Brzezinski went on to establish the Trilateral Commission, a think tank he directed along with Henry Kissinger. This strategy of using information technology to secure U.S. dominance became highly respected and accepted among the Council on Foreign Relations and the U.S. intelligence apparatus. The so-called deep state began engaging in covert activities to ensure that the United States came out ahead in the computer revolution. Corporations like IBM, Apple, Microsoft, and eventually Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Amazon were created due to covert and now admitted support from the intelligence agencies. Money from the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, the Department of Treasury, and other shadowy and unseen wings of the U.S. government provided loans and other forms of assistance to create what is now called Silicon Valley. California became the center of the computer revolution. The Soviet Union had its fair share of successes when it came to computer technology. The country launched the first spacecraft, the Sputnik satellite, and launched the first man into outer space. In 1957, Soviet engineer Leonid Ivanovich Kupriyanovich patented the first mobile phone. However, the Soviet Union had begun its process of rapid industrialization in 1928, and prior to that, it had been a non-industrialized agrarian society. The USSR simply did not have anywhere near the resources the United States had in order to invest in the computer revolution. While Western countries freely adopted Soviet technology and inventions like LED lights, the NATO countries created the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls. The New York Times described the treaty as organized to ensure that strategic technology, such as computers, machine tools, and microelectronics items that could be used for weapons and other military applications, did not fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union went as far as manufacturing its own home computer system in 1985, the Electronica BK0010. Regardless, the technology embargoes and lack of resources enabled the United States to set at the center of the global technology revolution. Ironically, this victory for Western capitalism was not generated by the market. If Brzezinski had not reoriented the deep state, and the intelligence apparatus had not poured its resources and efforts into creating massive computer corporations, the market would never have enabled the U.S. to win the technology war. The very methods that Western capitalism used to win over communism involve strategic central planning, not market chaos. A long-term economic crisis. But regardless, we now live amid a huge leap in technology. Years ago, thousands of people worked in factories that produced books called book binderies. Now, a single book with the press of a button can be produced by a single person. Short order cooks are becoming a thing of the past, along with assembly line workers of all kinds. Computers can trade stocks more effectively than humans can. Artificial intelligence and other breakthroughs are rendering human beings more and more irrelevant in the process of production. However, it is still from the wages paid out to workers that consumers derive their purchasing power. Furthermore, it is still only human labor that can generate profits for the capitalist. The built-in laws of capitalism have exploded into a long-term crisis of overproduction and falling profits. The huge monopolies that dominate the global market in the 21st century have gotten so good at producing goods that the world is now facing the greatest crisis of poverty amid plenty yet to be seen. The technological leaps have created a deep, systemic crisis of capitalism. Marxist writer Fred Goldstein explained in 2013, capitalist overproduction always causes these recessions. Production under capitalism expands very rapidly so long as there are markets. This is because of the laws of capitalist competition. The capitalists are in a permanent race to outproduce each other, to outsell each other, and to capture the markets from each other as each wants to gain the most profit. This competition drives the system, but they fight each other by racing to lower wages, increase production, and use technology to get rid of workers. So while production expands at a rapid pace under capitalism during a boom period, the income of the masses grows at a snail's pace, very, very gradually, or actually declines. Soon, the bosses find that they cannot sell their goods at a profit, so they shut down businesses and cut back workers' hours. The crisis of unemployment begins. This is the law of capitalism. It cannot operate in any other way. This is the profit system at work. This is called the boom and bust cycle. We say that capitalism is at a dead end because the traditional boom and bust cycle is over. There is no boom. It was the boom, or greatly increased production that put workers back to work during past recoveries. But once the system loses the ability to bounce back and move forward and upward in production and services, a permanent crisis sets in for the workers and the oppressed. He went on. They have created a technological machine that is so productive and a low-wage workforce that is so impoverished that as soon as they increase production at a rapid rate, the system fails. People cannot buy the commodities produced. Inventories back up, and no hiring goes on at all, or else layoffs take place. Capitalist productivity is strangling capitalist production. The capitalism of today, which is leading toward a more and more intense economic and social crisis, is not the capitalism of mere factory owners and wage workers. It is what Lenin called imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. It is the rule of the world by trusts, cartels, and syndicates, huge monopolies based in Wall Street and London. The Silicon Valley tech giants were preceded by the super major oil corporations and their respective houses of finance as the dominant axis within this global apparatus. As Lenin explained, the imperialist stage of capitalism is defined by financiers holding back and preventing economic development around the world in order to ensure their monopoly, carving out spheres of influence and captive markets in the colonized world. The globalist nature of 21st century capitalism recalls the words of British fascist Oswald Mosley, who bemoaned this emerging setup in the post-war years. The racist demagogue told his English audience in the early 1960s, "Every one of us in this hall was old enough to see before the war. Every one of you knows what happened. How the financial forces in the 30s went into these backward countries, into India, within the empire, into Hong Kong, into Japan, into China, and exploited these peoples to produce cheap, sweated goods which ruined the great industries of Britain and of Europe, which put Lancashire out of business in the cotton trade, Yorkshire out of business in the woolen trade, and these poor devils were exploited for a wage of a few shillings a week. For what purpose? To enable the City of London and Wall Street, New York, to make fatter profits. This is why it was done. That was the whole purpose. And all these countries have been exploited, thrown, and tossed aside by finance, and now becoming the victims of communism. So finance seeks fresh fields of exploitation. So where do they turn when the old people are exhausted? When many a poor laborer has died of consumption and of other horrible diseases in their sweatshops, when they've exhausted fields of exploitation, where do they turn now? New pastures, new forests, fresh virgin lands. And these poor devils are going to be sweated and exploited in Africa like the other poor devils in China, India, and Japan. A great new field for sweatshops to be opened up so that these new industries we are creating in Britain today can be destroyed as the old industries were. Simplified, rationalized machinery with a few white surveyors and the masses of cheap colored labor torn off the land and taken into the sweatshops to work and labor and cough their guts out with tuberculosis. Is that worthy of Britain? Is that the future of Europe? And is this competition to be organized within our European Brotherhood, bringing these sweat fields in Africa into our European civilization so that the financial power in one European country can be used against the financial power in another? All the great financial power of the world now shifted from the city of London to Wall Street, New York. Who shall be able, on the mass of money, of wealth, and of power it brings to it again and again, to exert its influence in politics, until, as you see today, it is childish nonsense to say that British government rules Britain. It's nothing to do with the British government or the British people. The government of the world is the financial government, the power of money and of money alone. During the 20th century, the Western capitalist home countries were kept stable by a layer of well-paid industrial workers who were loyal to their bosses. This aristocracy of labor was made up of working-class people who saw their living standards increase along with the ascendancy of the big corporations. This bought their loyalty and made them supportive of wars and defenders of the status quo. However, in the 21st century, the aristocracy of labor is being systematically destroyed. The once prosperous industrial cities have been reduced to ghost towns, dotted with empty, foreclosed homes. America's once booming suburbs have become centers of opioid addiction, human trafficking, bitter, decaying elderly people, and hopeless, angry youth. As the productive economy comes to a halt amid a long-term crisis of overproduction, the primary methods of profiteering among the already rich have become what some describe as destructive accumulation. Prisons for profit, military contracting, an epidemic of addiction caused by doctors being pushed to overprescribe dangerous painkillers. The public education system is being auctioned off to the highest bidder, with school choice charter schools where private corporations make money from maintaining the youth. Municipalities in 27 different U.S. states have become so indebted and bankrupt that they began unpaving roads, replacing paved roads with gravel dirt roads, saving money from the cost of maintaining them. The physical economy of the United States lays in ruin. The system has become cannibalistic to keep profits flowing when very little value is being created. This state of affairs cannot continue indefinitely without some kind of big dramatic fallout or correction. We should be reminded of how Karl Marx described how crises of overproduction are resolved. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. How can this crisis be solved? The resolution of the long-term economic crisis facing Western capitalist countries can be found in abolishing the system of production for profit. To put it simply, a government of action that fights for working families must mobilize the population to enforce rational planning and control over the means of production. The economy must be reinvented in order to function according to a central plan rather than merely the short-term gain of private owners. An economy where production is no longer dictated to profit, but rather on the basis of an overall plan is called socialism. Much like the word capitalism, this term has also been subjected to a huge amount of confusion and misunderstanding. All capitalist economies have somewhat of a state sector. Capitalist societies have roads paved by the government. The U.S. Constitution mandates the creation of a postal service that is publicly owned and not accountable to any individual owner. From the time of Adam Smith, even most ardent free marketers understood that some level of public works and state facilitation was necessary for the market to function. It is only since the 1970s and the rise of neoliberal economic delusions that anyone has been as confused as to see the post office, the U.S. military, or the private Federal Reserve Bank as socialism. Socialism is not synonymous with government or state ownership. In post-World War II Britain, almost every major industry was nationalized. This was done so they could be rebuilt at the expense of the taxpayer in order to facilitate the restoration and functioning of British imperialism and the economic dominance of British bankers on the global stage. Saudi Arabia maintains a heavily state-controlled economy, but though the government is heavily involved, the economy functions to maximize profits for the ruling family and its various cronies. Singapore also has a heavily state-run economy, but it is run to generate profits for the ruling families. Socialism is also not synonymous with taxation or redistribution of wealth. This goes on to some degree or other in all capitalist societies. Societies that maintain a bigger welfare state may have higher tax rates than societies that maintain a more libertarian approach, but neither is more socialist or more capitalist than the other. The Norwegian welfare states that currently face dramatic confusion from the inflow of refugees and their alliance with the NATO anti-Russia crusade are not socialist countries. Capitalism is production for profit, and socialism is an economy where profits are not in command. Socialism emerged in the 20th century as country after country broke free from the domination of Western imperialism and seized control of its industries and natural resources. Socialism in the 20th century involved popular governments that emerged in explosive revolutionary upsurges, mobilizing the population to industrialize, electrify, and modernize deeply impoverished countries. Ensuring economic growth. The notion that socialism does not work should seem laughable to anyone familiar with the basic economic history. The Russian Empire was an impoverished prison house of nations with massive illiteracy, a low life expectancy, and primitive agrarian economy when the Bolsheviks took power in 1917. By 1936, it was a fully industrialized superpower that produced more steel than any other country on Earth and had the biggest hydroelectrical facility ever constructed at that time, the Great Dnieper Dam. The 5-year economic plan launched under the leadership of Joseph Stalin in 1928 transformed the lives of millions of people. A huge modern educational system was created. Illiteracy was wiped out. Modern universities sprung up. Great achievements in athletics and the arts were carried out. The entire planet was in awe of the explosion of economic growth that socialist central planning was achieving in a once impoverished country. Writing for The Nation in 1931, Louis Fisher wrote, "The Soviet frontier is like a charmed circle which the world economic crisis cannot cross. While banks crash, while production falls, and trade languishes abroad, the Soviet Union continues in an orgy of construction and national development. The scale and speed of its progress are unprecedented." American radio personality Fraser Hunt, writing for the New York American in 1931, emphasized how dramatic the Soviet Union's explosion of economic growth really was. He said, Japan, westernizing and industrializing itself 50 years ago, was doing child's play compared to what the Soviet Union is doing today. Already, almost overnight, the USSR has become an industrial country. The problems of the Soviet Union set in after the initial wave of industrialization, and during the 1970s and 80s, the country was unable to adjust its socialist economic model due to changing circumstances. The inability to adjust led to the political crisis that saw the Soviet Union's demise. China, on the other hand, was able to rapidly adjust its socialist economic system, and starting in 1978, with the reform and opening up, China began speeding forward with 5-year economic plans, state-run banks and industries, and a Marxist-Leninist party in command of the economy. In a report from the World Bank published on April 1st, 2022, Manuela V. Ferro, World Bank Vice President for East Asia and Pacific, is quoted as saying, China's poverty reduction story is a story of persistent growth through economic transformation. The report adds, over the past 40 years, the number of people in China with incomes below $1.90 per day, the international poverty line as defined by the World Bank to track global extreme poverty, has fallen by close to 800 million. With this, China has contributed close to 3/4 of the global reduction in the number of people living in extreme poverty. At China's current national poverty line, the number of poor fell by 770 million over the same period. China's rapid growth is largely a result of its state-run economy organized to serve the purpose of building socialism with Chinese characteristics. Likewise, the World Economic Forum published an article on September 11, 2018 entitled The Story of Vietnam's Economic Miracle. The article observed, a mere 30 years ago, the country was one of the poorest in the world. The article went on, today, Vietnam is one of the stars of the emerging markets universe. Its economic growth of 6 to 7% rivals China, and its exports are worth as much as the total value of its GDP. Observing the source of Vietnam's strength, the World Economic Forum noted Vietnam has invested heavily in human and physical capital, predominantly through public investments. Vietnam invested a lot in its human capital and infrastructure. Facing a rapidly growing population, it stands at 95 million today, half of whom are under 35, and up from 60 million in 1986, Vietnam made large public investments in primary education. This was necessary as a growing population also means a growing need for jobs. But Vietnam also invested heavily in infrastructure, ensuring cheap mass access to the internet. The fourth industrial revolution is knocking on Southeast Asia's door, and having a sound IT infrastructure in place is essential preparation. Those investments paid off. Armed with the necessary infrastructure and with market-friendly policies in place, Vietnam became a hub for foreign investment and manufacturing in Southeast Asia. Since 2010, Vietnam's GDP growth has been at least 5% per year, and in 2017, it peaked at 6.8%. With such rapid economic growth, the country grew from one of the poorest countries in the world to a comfortably middle-income one. Whereas its GDP per capita was barely $230 in 1985, it was more than 10 times that in 2017, $2,343. Corrected for purchasing power, it stands even higher at over $6,000. There is certainly a role for private enterprise in a socialist economy, but profits and markets are not in control. A popular government is. The private enterprises are not free to function according to market logic, but guided and controlled by state subsidiaries and oversight. The socialist economy of Nicaragua, under the leadership of the Sandinistas, had astounding successes. Between 2005 and 2014, poverty in Nicaragua has decreased by 30%, according to the Wall Street Journal. GDP rose by 36% between 2007 and 2016. The shining success of the government that rules under the slogan Christianity, Socialism, and Solidarity has been its micro entrepreneurship program, which subsidizes low income Nicaraguans to start individual businesses or worker cooperatives. The socialist government of Evo Morales in Bolivia oversaw similar explosions of growth, with the highest GDP expansion in South America for many years. A 2019 article from The Nation observed, during the Morales era, the economy has grown at twice the rate of the Latin American average. Inflation has been stable, the government has amassed substantial savings, and an enterprising and optimistic indigenous middle class has emerged. The article described the policies through which the popular anti-imperialist government enabled this growth. Morales passed a law seizing tens of thousands of square miles of land deemed unproductive or illegally held, and redistributed it to landless peasants. He placed the natural gas, oil, telecommunications, and electricity industries under state control, and he continually raised the minimum wage, which has tripled since he entered office. Morales also dramatically increased social spending. He poured money into building roads, schools, and hospitals, an expansion of infrastructure that was particularly transformative in the countryside. And he established modest but deeply popular cash transfer programs, a universal non-contributory pension system for Bolivians over the age of 60, assistance to households with elementary school-aged children who can demonstrate their children are attending school, and funds for pregnant women or mothers with children under the age of 2 without health insurance. The living conditions of Cubans are far superior to those of Haitians, Dominicans, or Jamaicans in terms of access to healthcare, education, and employment. The Communist Party of Cuba presides over a socialist economy and has constructed what Ban Ki-moon calls the greatest medical school in the world. Socialism in Libya built the world's largest irrigation system, the Great Man-Made River. Under Gaddafi's leadership, Libya had the highest life expectancy on the African continent and experienced huge amounts of economic growth. Socialism constructed the massive Aswan Dam, the biggest hydroelectric power plant in the Middle East, which fully electrified Egypt. Both socialism brought running water, electricity, and literacy to Syria. When the chaos in the market, the anarchy of production, is overcome, economic growth is no longer restrained. With socialist central planning, human creativity, and the drive to expand are no longer held back. The problems inherent in production, organized for profit, are overcome. A government of action. The solution to the crisis in the United States can best be summarized with the slogan, "We need a government of action to fight for working families." The state must step in and control the centers of economic power, forcing production to move ahead and wealth to increase. The invisible hand must be pushed aside, and a state that enacts the popular will must assert itself over the means of production. If a government came to power in Washington, D.C., and carried out the following 4 steps, the U.S. economy would regenerate rapidly. A mass mobilization to rebuild the country. A government action would hire millions of unemployed or underemployed people and put them to work rebuilding the country. This would mean a mobilization by the state to build new hospitals, power plants, water treatment facilities, schools, universities, high-tech research facilities, and a high-speed railway. Public ownership of natural resources. A government of action would institute public control over natural resources. The wealth generated from America's oil, natural gas, coal, and timber would go into the public budget rather than into the pockets of private owners. This would ensure that the state had enough resources to fund its efforts, stimulate the economy, oversee growth, and lift the burden of taxation from the population. Centralization and public control of banking and credit. A government of action would centralize credit and banking in the hands of the state, lending money strategically at a state, federal, and local level. Credit would be assigned based on enacting an overall economic vision and ensuring long-term growth rather than simply the profits of private lenders. The massive debt that hangs over the U.S. economy as a curse must be canceled, and the debt industry forcibly broken up by the state. An economic bill of rights. A government of action could then implement an economic bill of rights, ensuring the population the right to jobs, housing, education, and healthcare. The population would be maintained for the good of the country overall. People would be seen as assets to the society, capable of creating wealth and making the country stronger. Thus, it would be in society's interest to make sure the population is healthy, well educated, and fully utilized for the good of the country overall. These actions would result in a rise in wages and the near elimination of unemployment. Small businesses would flourish. Regions that are struggling and stagnating would become renewed and filled with prosperity and hope. These 4 steps are within the reach of the U.S. government. Governments across the planet have carried out similar endeavors. However, these 4 steps erode the property rights of wealthy corporations. The right of private bankers to lend money at interest would be eradicated. The oil and natural gas wells, the coal mines, and other resources that are the private corporation's property would be seized by the public. The state would become the primary employer, with an industrial and construction army being mobilized to regenerate the economy. Taxes would decrease. Private property and personal property would still exist on a massive scale. Inequality of income would certainly remain a reality. None of these steps would be the socialist nightmare envisioned by right-wingers. In fact, they would be the opposite. These steps would result in making America great again, more effectively than anything Trump has so far put forward. A wall along the border, protectionism in the form of tariffs and renegotiated trade deals, renewed emphasis on national sovereignty against globalism would all be almost meaningless compared to these 4 dramatic steps. In order to enact these 4 steps, a government would need to have massive public support, and this support could not come in the form of silent approval. A well-organized and awakened public would have to back the efforts of popular leaders to enact these policies. Though it seems far off, the conditions in the United States for such a government of action to emerge are ripening. Divisions among the elite are intensifying, and conditions are worsening for the broad masses. The remainder of this book will focus on how a government of action could emerge as the crisis rooted in the built-in flaws of capitalism becomes more intense. Okay, so I'm taking a little break here. We've gotten to chapter 2, and the man himself, the author, is in the audience. Very cool, buddy. Yeah, I like it. Hey, I appreciate that. We got to get the word out. That's why I'm doing this. Brilliant so far. I love it so far. If I remember correctly, you told me that it was in 4 parts. I was going to try to read a part a day, but I'm looking at the contents here. Yeah, 4 parts. So I'm on part 2. All right. Part 2 is a long one. Page 39 to 146. So maybe I won't read it part 1, part 2. I'm going to read for about another hour, Yeah, I'm going to read for another hour, and we'll go from there. You guys listening, I'm going to go back through this. I've got GarageBand opened over here so I can get a really nice high quality audio that I can normalize and make sound fancy pantsy for my friend Mr. Maupin. So we'll go back and fix it. But for today, I'm going to read for another hour, and we'll go from there. All right. So let's go back, make sure we're recording, switch to the book. All right. Chapter 2, Part 2, Bonapartism and Fascism in the 21st Century. The Road to 2008, Napoleon's Nephew, the First Bonapartist, Bonapartism in the United States, Bonapartism Case Study, Nazi Germany, There is no fascist ideology or aesthetic, The Nazis in Power, Bonapartism Case Study, Roosevelt's America, Roosevelt's Worldview, The Difference Between Rooseveltism and Nazism, Fascist Economics in the 21st Century, Bringing Depopulation Home, The Distortion of Marxism, Reinventing Anti-Racism, The Proposed High-Tech Dark Ages. The deep crisis of overproduction and falling rates of profit, which has gripped the global economic apparatus centered around Wall Street and London, has forced the ruling class to strain itself and scramble for new methods of stabilizing society. So far, these methods have largely been unsuccessful, and the crisis continues. The road to 2008. When the 2008 financial crash hit the United States, it became very apparent that the old methods of managing both the economy and the public were no longer sufficient. All the smartest economists had been unable to prevent a dramatic Wall Street crash. Since 2008, the U.S. has been spinning from political crisis to political crisis, with unrest continuing to break out among the population, as all the smartest managers of the masses have been unable to restore domestic tranquility. Alan Greenspan, a committed follower and personal protege of Ayn Rand, had been running the U.S. Federal Reserve since the 1980s. He had pushed deregulation of lending in accordance with his overall free market, libertarian perspective. However, as the 21st century rolled around, Greenspan escalated his deregulatory push for non-ideological reasons. The reality was that the spending power of the U.S. public was decreasing. The good-paying industrial jobs had been eliminated by technology and offshoring. Technology was replacing human labor at the assembly line. The problem of overproduction was becoming a daily reality in the aftermath of the 90s dot-com boom. A U.S. public that had seen its living standards go down, while the rest of household debt went up, couldn't afford to keep purchasing things. After the September 11th terrorist attacks, President George W. Bush urged Americans who wanted to help the country to go out and shop. His call was echoed by all the top CEOs and major media outlets. Alan Greenspan pushed for deregulation of credit card lending practices to make sure this spending could be facilitated. Greenspan also pushed the deregulation of mortgage lenders in order to ensure that Americans could keep buying homes and to encourage Americans to take out second mortgages on homes they already owned in order to deal with living expenses. The result was a wave of home foreclosures across the Midwest, California, and much of the country. Soon, the housing bubble burst, and the rest is history. The U.S. economy has largely never recovered. The lost jobs have never returned. The family-owned home is becoming a thing of the past. The once prosperous suburbs of the American heartland are financially devastated. The next generation languishes in a life of low-wage, short-term service sector jobs, and household debt continues rising. U.S. President George W. Bush's unilateral invasion of Iraq drove up oil prices, making lots of profits for Wall Street, but also strengthening anti-imperialist forces in Russia, Iran, Libya, and Venezuela. The economic crisis was compounded by the fact that internationally, the forces of resistance to Western capitalism had significantly rebounded during the first years of the 21st century. George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq had driven a major oil-producing state off the market, and the oil prices had shot up to the highest in history. This wasn't just good for Chevron, BP, Shell, and ExxonMobil. It was also good for Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. Russia's President Vladimir Putin had restructured Russia's economy to be centered around state-controlled oil and gas. The wave of state revenue that came from Bush's oil price hike enabled Putin to rebuild Russia's industrial base. In the Republic of Venezuela, President Hugo Chavez used oil revenue to launch a continent-wide anti-imperialist movement called Bolivarian Socialism. Soon, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Ecuador were on board with a leftist mass movement that swept the hemisphere. A new brand of politics that mixed Marxism with Christianity and indigenous pride and heritage was reinventing the region, and China was pouring in as the foreign investor to help the process along. The hardliners of Iran, who took to heart the anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist goals of the Islamic Revolution, were brought back into power after Bush named Iran as one of the axis of evil. In 2006, Hezbollah, the Iran-aligned Shia revolutionary movement of Lebanon, became the heroes of the entire Muslim world after inflicting a humiliating defeat to Israeli invaders. The Muslim allies of the USA, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, and even some among the Saudi camp, had not appreciated Bush referring to the war on terror as a crusade. The anti-Islamic rhetoric of Bush's supporters in the American religious right alienated them further. In light of the domestic economy crashing and the international forces of anti-imperialism riding high, Bush and the neoconservatives were suddenly out of a job. Barack Hussein Obama swept into office in the hopes of restarting the U.S. economy, improving U.S. relations with Middle Eastern proxy fighters, as well as NATO allies. Obama was met with swift opposition from the Tea Party and other forces that wanted a more deregulated economic setup. The dramatic battle that has been unfolding among the elite in the United States represents a process called Bonapartism by scientific socialists. In hopes of resolving the crisis and stabilizing society, sections of the capitalist class are battling each other for control of the state and the ability to use the state to take strong economic measures that cut into the profits of their rivals. Napoleon's nephew, the first Bonapartist. In 1851, Karl Marx was living in Paris and closely observing the political turmoil that resulted from a crisis of capitalism. Workers were on strike, unemployed, and hungry people were rioting, and the military was in the streets, attempting to prevent a total explosion of unrest. In June, Paris was shaken by a working-class uprising. Marx wrote, "On the side of the Paris proletariat stood none but itself. More than 3,000 insurgents were butchered after the victory, and 15,000 were deported without trial. With this defeat, the proletarian passes into the background on the revolutionary stage. It attempts to press forward again on every occasion, as soon as the movement appears to make a fresh start, but with ever-decreasing expenditure of strength and always slighter results. Among the rich and powerful, two factions emerged. The factory owners wanted a heavy-handed crackdown on the unrest. They sought to bring back the monarchy before the sanctity of religion and get the broad masses of French workers to be less uppity by reinstating much of the traditional authoritarianism that had existed under feudalism before the revolution. This conservative faction was called the Party of Order. It was old money, aristocrats, and conservative military figures. However, the more powerful finance capitalists had a different plan. They sought to harness some of the unrest in the streets and the nostalgia for the French Revolution among the population. In order to bring in a government that would use the state to stabilize the economy and get growth going again. In opposition to the Party of Order, they formed the Society of December 10th. They tapped Louis Bonaparte, the nephew of French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Declaring himself the new emperor, Louis seized power with the backing of the military, crowning himself Napoleon III. Decades before, Napoleon Bonaparte had declared himself military dictator in November of 1799, bringing to an end the 10-year period of political confusion and turmoil that came in the aftermath of the French Revolution. Napoleon had stabilized the country using heavy-handed military rule to enact reforms that lined up with the progressive sentiments of the Enlightenment. The first Napoleon had called himself the Revolution in Boots and proceeded to march his empire across Europe. In 1851, the hope on the part of France's finance capitalists was that Louis would do just as his uncle had done a generation earlier and bring stability to the country by tapping into the ideals of the revolution and mobilizing the population. In his book, Market Elections, Vince Copeland explains this tendency that Marx first described in 1852. Copeland writes, "The phenomenon of calling upon one class against another and seeming to rise above class while serving the status quo has been called Bonapartism, after Napoleon Bonaparte and his nephew, Louis Bonaparte. The first Bonaparte was so all-powerful and seemed to concentrate all the political power so much in his own person that the feudal kings of Europe literally pushed one another aside to kiss his hands. This was before they ganged up with the British bourgeoisie to defeat him in 1815. Actually, Napoleon's tremendous political power flowed from the fact that with military means he could save the new bourgeoisie bankers from the political overthrow of the feudal aristocracy, while at the same time using the same means, he held down the revolutionary masses who were willing to fight feudalism and the bankers to the end. His power flowed from the fact that he employed huge armies of newly freed peasants to join with the serfs of old feudal Europe to overthrow their feudal masters in other countries, thus securing his own reputation as the ever-victorious general. Marx wrote of the two Napoleons. Hegel remarks somewhere that all great world historical facts and personages occur, as it were, twice. He has forgotten to add, the first time as tragedy, the second as farce. Louis Bonaparte was a demagogue who engaged in all kinds of political stunts to gain popularity. He raffled off bars of gold and paid for impoverished French people to move to California during the 1849 gold rush. This charade was illegal under French law, but Bonaparte considered himself to be above the law and had sections of the military and mobs of desperately poor lumpen proletarians who marched behind him. In the aftermath of the 1848 working class uprising in France, Louis Bonaparte began positioning himself to establish a military dictatorship to stabilize society. Louis Bonaparte's political movement that openly flaunted the law was tolerated because it offered an alternative to the revolutionary socialist radicalism that was widespread among the population. Louis Bonaparte's seizure of power in 1851 was necessitated by the fact that the widespread discussions and debates that resulted from having elections and competing political parties put the rule of the rich and powerful in danger. To bring order to society and stop the threat of working class uprisings, the capitalists needed to abolish the democratic institutions they themselves had created when overthrowing feudalism. Marx wrote, "What the bourgeoisie did not grasp, however, was the logical conclusion that its own parliamentary regime, its political rule in general, was now also bound to meet with the general verdict of condemnation as being socialist. As long as the rule of the bourgeois class had not been completely organized, as long as it had not acquired its pure political expression, the antagonism of the other classes likewise could not appear in its pure form, and where it did appear, could not take the dangerous turn that transforms every struggle against the state power into a struggle against capital. If in every stirring of life in society it saw tranquility imperiled, how could it want to maintain at the head of society a regime of unrest, its own regime, the parliamentary regime? This regime that, according to the expression of one of its spokesmen, lives in struggle and by struggle. The parliamentary regime lives by discussion. How shall it forbid discussion? Every interest, every social institution is here transformed into general ideas, debated as ideas. How shall any interest, any institution, sustain itself above thought and impose itself as an article of faith? The struggle of the orators on the platform evokes the struggle of the scribblers of the press. The debating club in Parliament is necessarily supplemented by debating clubs in the salons and the bistros. The representatives, who constantly appeal to public opinion, give public opinion the right to speak its real mind in petitions. The parliamentary regime leaves everything to the decision of majorities. How shall the great majorities outside Parliament not want to decide? When you play the fiddle at the top of the state, what else is to be expected but that those down below dance? Thus, by now stigmatizing as socialistic what it had previously extolled as liberal, the bourgeoisie confesses that its own interests dictate that it should be delivered from the danger of its own rule, that to restore tranquility in the country, its bourgeois parliament must, first of all, be given its quietus, that to preserve its social power intact, its political power must be broken, that the individual bourgeois can continue to exploit the other classes and to enjoy undisturbed property, family, religion, and order only on condition that their class be condemned along with the other classes to like political nullity, that in order to save its purse, it must forfeit the crown, and the sword that is to safeguard it must at the same time be hung over its own head as a sword of Damocles. Ironically, the very capitalist newspapers that had called for suppression of socialists and working class agitators now screamed in outrage as Louis Bonaparte crushed their freedom of speech. Marx wrote on this irony as well. The extra parliamentary mass of the bourgeoisie, on the other hand, by its servility toward the president, by its vilification of parliament, by its brutal maltreatment of its own press, invited Bonaparte to suppress and annihilate its speaking and writing section, its politicians and its literati, its platform and its press, so it would then be able to pursue its private affairs with full confidence in the protection of a strong and unrestricted government. It declared unequivocally that it longed to get rid of its own political rule in order to get rid of the troubles and dangers of ruling. And this extra parliamentary bourgeoisie, which had already rebelled against the purely parliamentary and literary struggle for the rule of its own class and had betrayed the leaders of this struggle, now dares, after the event, to indict the proletariat for not having risen in a bloody struggle, a life and death struggle on its behalf. In order to stay in power, Louis Bonaparte's faction among the rich and powerful of France had to build up a base of support among the wider population. It entered an alliance with the small farmers, the labor unions, and various left-wing agitators who kept the spirit of the French Revolution alive. Small farmers constituted the biggest base of support for the new regime. Marx wrote, "And yet, the state power is not suspended in the air. Bonaparte represented a class, and the most numerous class of French society at that, the small holding peasants. The small holding peasants form an enormous mass whose members live in similar conditions, but without entering into manifold relations with each other. Their mode of production isolates them from one another, instead of bringing them into mutual intercourse. The isolation is furthered by France's poor means of communication and the poverty of the peasants. They are therefore incapable of asserting their class interest in their own name, whether through a parliament or a convention. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. Their representative must at the same time appear as their master, as an authority over them, an unlimited governmental power which protects them from the other classes and sends them rain and sunshine from above. The political influence of these small holding peasants, therefore, finds its final expression in the executive power which subordinates society to itself. Louis Bonaparte formed an army of desperately poor people, criminals, intellectuals, and marginal elements of society called the Society of December 10th. They poured into the streets to cheer him on as the French army divisions that had previously occupied North Africa marched into Paris and arrested his political rivals on December 1st and 2nd of 1851. Over 300 people were killed in the political violence that followed in the next few days. First, Bonaparte arrested the members of parliament from the Party of Order who opposed him, as well as others who spoke out publicly against his coup. Thousands of people were deported to prisons in France's colonial territories in Africa and South America. Many wealthy people had their property confiscated. The famous writer Victor Hugo was forced to flee the country. When the dust cleared on December 20th, Louis Bonaparte held a national referendum asking the public to vote on whether or not he should remain in power. And he won, with over 7 million people casting their ballots in support of him. Once secured in power, Bonaparte declared the Second French Empire, saying, "Some people say the empire is at war. I say the empire is at peace. We have immense unplowed territories to cultivate, roads to open, ports to dig, rivers to be made navigable, canals to finish, a railway network to complete. We have ruins to repair, false gods to tear down, truths which we need to make triumph. This is how I see the empire." Marx observed the new authoritarian regimes springing up under the auspices of nostalgia for the French Revolution, writing, "The Constitution, the National Assembly, the dynastic parties, the blue and the red republicans, the heroes of Africa, the thunder from the platform, the sheet lightning of the daily press, the entire literature, the political names and the intellectual reputations, the civil law and penal code, the liberty, equality, fraternity, and the 2nd of May, 1852, all have vanished like a phantasmagoria before the spell of a man whom even his enemies do not make out to be a magician. Universal suffrage seems to have survived only for a moment, in order that with its own hand it may make its last will and testament before the eyes of all the world and declare in the name of the people itself, everything that exists has this much worth, that it will perish. With his dictatorial power, Louis Bonaparte worked to resolve the crisis of overproduction that had gripped the French economy and caused so much unrest. He created government-run factories and national workshops to hire unemployed people, and he used taxpayer money to create free hospitals for poor people to get medical care. He had the government build railways to stimulate the industries. He enacted a 12-hour workday to improve conditions for factory workers and increase employment. Those who had opposed these reforms, most especially the Conservative Party of Order, had been forced to flee the country, if not arrested, imprisoned, or outright killed during the coup. The monarchy had been the rallying point of many conservatives, so Bonaparte specifically worked to make sure the old King Louis Philippe's family could never be restored to power. The deposed royal family was banned from owning any property, and all inheritance members of the monarch's family received was confiscated by the state. Freedom of the press was gotten rid of, and newspapers were forced to have everything they wrote approved by government censors. The Ministry of Education reviewed university courses and vetted professors to make sure what they taught fit the goals of the government. Professors deemed to be monarchists or sympathetic to the party of the order were fired. Marx wrote about the irony of the very bourgeois figures who brutally repressed the June proletarian uprising, now facing heavy-handed government repression from Louis Bonaparte. During the June days, all classes and parties had united in the party of order against the proletarian class as the party of anarchy, of socialism, of communism. They had saved society from the enemies of society. They had given out the watchwords of the old society: property, family, religion, order, to their army as passwords, and had proclaimed to the counter-revolutionary crusaders, "In this sign thou shalt conquer." From that moment, as soon as one of the numerous parties which gathered under this sign against the June insurgents seeks to hold the revolutionary battlefield in its own class interest, it goes down before the cry, "Property, family, religion, order." Society is saved just as often as the circle of its rulers contracts, as a more exclusive interest is maintained against a wider one. Every demand of the simplest bourgeois financial reform, of the most ordinary liberalism, of the most formal republicanism, of the most shallow democracy, is simultaneously castigated as an attempt on society and stigmatized as socialism. And finally, the high priests of religion and order themselves are driven with kicks from their Pythian tripods, hauled out of their beds in the darkness of night, put in prison vans, thrown into dungeons, or sent into exile. Their temple is razed to the ground, their mouths are sealed, their pens broken, their law torn to pieces in the name of religion, of property, of the family, of order. Bourgeois fanatics for order are shot down on their balconies by mobs of drunken soldiers, their domestic sanctuaries profaned, their houses bombarded for amusement, in the name of property, of the family, of religion, and of order. What happened in 1851 was not a revolution by any means. It was a power struggle among the capitalists to determine how the government would act in order to deal with an economic crisis. An economic crisis of overproduction had resulted in a political crisis among the French capitalists. The political crisis had resulted in the Western liberal French society collapsing into authoritarianism and illiberalism in order to bring back stability. As Marx observed, the bourgeoisie apothecized the sword. The sword rules it. It destroyed the revolutionary press. Its own press is destroyed. It placed popular meetings under police surveillance. Its salons are placed under police supervision. It disbanded the Democratic National Guard. Its own National Guard is disbanded. It imposed a state of siege. A state of siege is imposed upon it. It supplanted the juries by military commissions. Its juries are supplanted by military commissions. It subjected public education to the sway of the priests. The priests subject it to their own education. It jailed people without trial. It is being jailed without trial. It suppressed every stirring in society by means of state power. Every stirring in its society is suppressed by means of state power. Out of enthusiasm for its money bags, it rebelled against its own politicians and literary men. Its politicians and literary men are swept aside, but its money bag is being plundered now that its mouth has been gagged and its pen broken. France, therefore, seems to have escaped the despotism of a class only to fall back under the despotism of an individual, and what is more, under the authority of an individual without authority. The struggle seems to be settled in such a way that all classes, equally powerless and equally mute, fall on their knees before the rifle butt. Under Louis Bonaparte, the bankers and farmers won out. The factory owners lost, but so did the revolutionary working class movement. Bonaparte would like to appear as the patriarchal benefactor of all classes, but he cannot give to one without taking from another, Marx observed. All kinds of economic reform programs were introduced in the hopes of stabilizing capitalism, pleasing one group of society, and preventing instability. The French economy got better for a time as a result of massive government intervention, but it did not last. Marx noted, driven by the contradictory demands of his situation, and being at the same time like a juggler, under the necessity of keeping the public gaze on himself, as Napoleon's successor, by springing constant surprises, that is to say, under the necessity of arranging a coup d'etat in miniature every day, Bonaparte throws the whole bourgeois economy into confusion, violates everything that seems inviolable to the revolution of 1848, makes some tolerant of revolution and makes others lust for it, and produces anarchy in the name of order, while at the same time stripping the entire state machinery of its halo, profaning it and making it at once loathsome and ridiculous. As Louis Bonaparte stayed in power, the French government had to spend more and more money to keep the economy rolling. The problem of overproduction, the root of the crisis, persisted. Finally, in 1870, France went to war with Prussia and lost. The results of the Franco-Prussian War were the eventual collapse of the French government and the temporary establishment of a communist government in the capital city, the Paris Commune of 1871. Marx, living in Paris during 1851 and 1852, observed the struggles in the streets, the protests, the strikes, and coup d'etat firsthand. His groundbreaking pamphlet quoted above is called the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. He stated that the purpose of his pamphlet was to demonstrate how the class struggle in France created circumstances and relationships that made it possible for a grotesque mediocrity to play a hero's part. The concept of Bonapartism is a widely misunderstood or overlooked piece of analysis that Marx put forth. Essentially, the crisis of capitalism drives the capitalists to turn against the liberal principles they came to power espousing. During the overthrow of feudalism, capitalists had screamed about liberty, equality, fraternity, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They had composed documents extolling the rights of man. However, in a capitalist crisis, these principles had to be abandoned in order to restore order. Not only did Louis Bonaparte violate the freedom of the press and freedom of speech that French society had once boasted of, but he imposed on the property rights of capitalists. He nationalized industries, he used the massive state bureaucracy, and he mobilized peasants, workers, and lumpen mobs to get his way and try to stabilize a naturally unstable system. Bonapartism in the United States. A long-term crisis of overproduction, such as the one currently gripping the Western financial order, results in dramatic divisions and fights among the capitalist class. These fights are resolved with one faction seizing control of the state and suppressing others, while enacting economic policies to resolve the crisis. Bonapartism is not foreign to the United States. Throughout U.S. history, there have been many examples of heavy-handed state repression being used to implement economic reforms and offset an economic crisis. Abraham Lincoln was a Bonapartist. He used the federal government to crush an uprising of slaveholders. In order to win the war, he engaged in all kinds of strong-arm authoritarian tactics, executing slave traders who violated the Emancipation Proclamation, reforming the U.S. currency with greenbacks, and holding an election in 1864 in which Southern states were not able to participate. Like Louis Bonaparte, Lincoln formed a coalition of radicals and rabble-rousers, religious fanatics who opposed slavery, small farmers called free soilers, poets like Walt Whitman, intellectuals like Emerson and Thoreau, labor unionists, and others were Lincoln's Society of December 10th. To win the U.S. Civil War, Lincoln made Harriet Tubman the first woman ever to lead U.S. soldiers into battle, giving her and other former slaves weapons to raid plantations along the Combahee River in South Carolina. Lincoln allowed German immigrant and communist August Willich to rise to the rank of brigadier general in the U.S. Army. He commissioned Joseph Wedemeyer to lead the Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment, an openly communist division of the Union Army that carried the red flag as its emblem. A generation later, Woodrow Wilson functioned as a bit of Bonapartist in the United States as well. Wilson took power presenting himself as a highly educated professor who could use his expertise to stabilize the country amid rising labor unrest and economic crisis. Wilson associated himself with the progressive movement and promised reforms to make life better for working people and make U.S. society more rational and modern. Abraham Lincoln made Harriet Tubman the first woman to lead U.S. soldiers into battle. She led a band of former slaves to raid plantations along the Combahee River in South Carolina. Wilson faced opposition from the urban political machines of major U.S. cities. In New York City, Chicago, and Philadelphia, many Roman Catholic immigrants were gaining political influence within the Democratic Party and city governments. Police, firemen, and other urban public servants tended to be Irish or Italian and Roman Catholic. Meanwhile, small farmers and others living in rural areas of the Midwest and South remained loyal to the Republican Party that had emerged with Lincoln. In order to gain the upper hand within his own party and over the Republicans, Woodrow Wilson arranged for Hollywood to create the first full-length movie in history. Director G.W. Griffith created The Birth of a Nation, a propaganda film retelling the history of the U.S. Civil War, demonizing Lincoln, and presenting the Ku Klux Klan as heroes who protected whites from misguided attempts to give black people equal rights. Quotes from Wilson's writings on U.S. history appeared in the film as captions. Audiences were so fired up with hatred from watching the film Wilson helped create that on several occasions they went and lynched black people after the screening had concluded. Shortly after the release of The Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan was reestablished in a mass rally in Stone Mountain, Georgia. The KKK became a mass right-wing political movement that mobilized small farmers to oppose Roman Catholics, Jews, and the Republican Party. The Klan functioned as Wilson's shock troops to retake control of the Democratic Party from the urban political machines and win the rural areas in the Midwest away from the Republicans. Shortly after launching the KKK, Wilson was reelected as president in 1916. Wilson's campaign slogan was, "He kept us out of war," and he was reelected promising to keep the U.S. out of the First World War that was waging across Europe. However, after he was re-inaugurated, the RMS Lusitania, a UK-registered ocean liner, was sunk, and the press reported that Germany had attempted to recruit Mexico to attack the United States with the infamous and probably forged Zimmerman telegram. Wilson then led the United States to declare war on Germany and enter the conflict on the side of the British and French. When the U.S. entered the First World War, Wilson established a near full-scale military dictatorship. The Socialist Party and the industrial workers of the world were crushed by the Department of Justice. Mass rounding up and deporting of immigrants who were accused of being communists took place with the infamous Palmer raids. Hundreds of people were sent to federal prison for speaking against the war. J. Edgar Hoover rose up the ranks of the Justice Department, working against communists and labor unionists, eventually establishing the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Just before Wilson left office in 1921, the Ku Klux Klan and the Republican Party successfully passed prohibition outlawing alcoholic beverages. Wilson used authoritarian tactics to stabilize the U.S. economy amid a crisis. Lincoln and Wilson were both wildly popular, presenting themselves as champions of the people. They both crushed many rich and powerful people in the process of stabilizing the economy, though they protected others whom they aligned with. Wilson, like Louis Bonaparte, was eventually forced to go to war as his methods of stabilizing the economy became exhausted. Let's recall what Marx wrote about how capitalism resolves the crisis of overproduction. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. What better means of carrying out destruction of a mass of productive forces than war? War also can lead to conquest of new markets. And who can better enforce the more thorough exploitation of the existing economy than a strong-armed tyrant? Bonapartism is part of the natural breakdown of the capitalist economy in the long-term crisis of overproduction, which arises naturally from its drive for technological innovation and maximizing profits. The political turmoil facing the United States since 2008 makes perfect sense when this understanding is provided. It is also worth noting that Bonapartists are generally widely hated by the capitalist class, despite their activities being necessary to save the economy. After Lincoln's assassination, the U.S. government eventually removed federal troops from the South and enabled the Jim Crow segregation system to emerge. U.S. history was taught for generations from the Southern perspective, and films like Gone with the Wind repeated the narrative first put forward in The Birth of a Nation, where Lincoln was portrayed as tyrannical. The Bonapartism of Wilson was similarly decried after serving its temporary purpose. By 1924, the Ku Klux Klan had so much power within the Democratic Party that many among the ruling elite were threatened by it. To rally support among the population, the KKK began engaging in much more pseudo-populist rhetoric and targeting figures among the elite, in addition to its usual scapegoats, blacks, Jews, and Catholics. A resolution condemning the KKK by name could not be passed at the Democrat Party's 1924 National Convention. Historian Linda Gordon describes the convention this way. The Democrats were divided, not only among candidates for the nomination, but most intensely between pro and anti-Klan factions. The Democratic Convention became known as the Klan Bake, signifying both the intensity of animosities among the delegates on the floor and the record-breaking heat outside. The Ku Klux Klan was the propagandist in this drama. It was outraged because the New York delegation had the temerity to nominate New York Governor Al Smith, a Catholic, for the presidential ticket. Before the convention, he appeared to be the strongest candidate, but he was anathema to the Klan. Not only a Catholic, not only an opponent of prohibition, he aggressively denounced the Klan's candidate, William Gibbs McAdoo, former Secretary of the Treasury, a darling of evangelicals because he was an uncompromising prohibitionist. McAdoo even supported the ban on alcohol at the convention. He commanded the loyalty of many working class and populist voters because earlier in his career, he had supported workmen's compensation for workplace accidents, unemployed insurance, the 8-hour workday, and a minimum wage. In 1924, the Democratic Party was held hostage by the Ku Klux Klan. The National Convention went on for 13 days as delegates could not agree on a nominee. Just across the river from the 1924 Democratic Convention in Manhattan, the KKK had a rally to support McAdoo with 20,000 people attending. They not only burned crosses, but also effigies of Al Smith. As delegates left the convention hall in Madison Square Garden each night, they could see burning crosses across the river in New Jersey. Violence on the floor of the convention broke out on several occasions, and a resolution condemning the Ku Klux Klan narrowly failed to pass. The convention went on for 16 days, and was the longest major party convention in U.S. history. Though Ku Klux Klan candidate McAdoo had clearly won the overwhelming majority of the popular vote in the Democratic primary, the Democratic Party machine was able to block him. However, the Klan was able to prevent Al Smith, the favored establishment candidate, from getting the nomination. Ultimately, the Democrats nominated John W. Davis, a somewhat bland candidate who lost to Republican Calvin Coolidge in the general election. Only after 106 different ballots were cast could the Democratic Party finally agree on a nominee for president. The 1924 convention, full of chaos and widely reported on by the press, clearly indicated that the Ku Klux Klan was a threat to the political establishment. Many of the rich and powerful people shifted their support to rival wings of the Democratic Party. In the 1920s, the U.S. economy was stabilizing amid the Roaring Twenties, and there was no longer a need for an army of brown shirts and white sheets to keep order. A public relations war and a campaign of prosecutions from the U.S. Department of Justice soon reduced the KKK's size and influence. Linda Gordon writes, by 1927, Klan membership had shrunk from several million to about 350,000. Scandals exposing the leader's crimes, hypocrisy, and misbehavior hit both local and national newspapers. In Indiana, Klan member Governor Ed Jackson was indicted for bribery. The officers of the state's major Klan bank were indicted for embezzlement and grand larceny. And a Klan minister was accused of crimes so sensational that persons who heard the sordid details loathed to believe they were true. The FBI prosecuted Klan leader Edward Clark for violating Prohibition and the Mann Act, which criminalized taking an unmarried woman across state lines for immoral purposes. In 1928, Al Smith was able to win the Democratic nomination without much ruckus, though he lost in the general election. Abraham Lincoln was deemed necessary amid the crisis and Civil War of the 1860s, but afterwards he was assassinated, his policies reversed, and Reconstruction was betrayed. In 1877, Jim Crow segregation was implemented across the South as federal troops were withdrawn. From then on, Lincoln was diminished by historians, and Gone with the Wind became the standard establishment interpretation of U.S. history. Likewise, while the KKK had functioned as shock troops to give Wilson the power to enact certain reforms and take the U.S. into the First World War, afterwards it was widely condemned and stripped of political power. The Klan has been a fringe political current ever since. Once the capitalist economy is growing again, Bonapartist leaders and the mass movements they create are tossed aside by the ruling class. While they are necessary in a crisis, their very existence is a threat to capitalist power. Marx explained why in the Communist Manifesto. Altogether, collisions between the classes of the old society further, in many ways, the course of development of the proletariat. The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself, whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry, at all times with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. In all these battles, it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for help, and thus to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. Empowering working class people and bringing them into politics, which is necessary for Bonapartists, lays the seeds for a potentially overthrowing capitalism. Bonapartism case study. Nazi Germany. The prolonged capitalist crisis of the 1930s brought in a new wave of Bonapartist leaders in the Western capitalist countries, who took dramatic moves to liquidate the crisis. The groundbreaking work of political economy, fascism, and social revolution written by R. Palm Dutt in 1934, described how the response of the capitalist governments of the world to the Great Depression was to unleash destruction. He wrote, "The distinctive modern stage of capitalist policy for the destruction of wealth and of the productive forces is marked by three outstanding characteristics. The first is the gigantic scale of destruction, conducted over entire principal world areas of production and calculated in relation to world stocks. The second is the direct government organization and subsiding of such destruction and restriction of production by all the leading imperialist governments. The third is the extension of destruction, not only to the destruction of existing stocks of commodities, but to the destruction of the productive forces, the plowing up of crops and sown areas, the artificial limitation of production, the dismantling of machinery, as well as holding unused the labor power of millions of workers. The examples of this process throughout the capitalist world are too familiar to require repetition. The burning of millions of bags of coffee or tons of grain in the midst of mass starvation and poverty have horrified the world. But all this has not been accidental or exceptional happening through the action of individuals, but on the contrary, directly organized by all the capitalist governments of the world, and in the forefront by the most progressive governments, by the Roosevelt government in the United States, by social democratic governments, etc. During a capitalist crisis, the capitalists often mobilize mass destruction of productive forces in the hopes of stabilizing the economy. Bonapartism that focuses on restarting the economy with destruction is called fascism. And this definition of fascism as a particular form of Bonapartist maneuvering is key to understanding political developments in our time. The most clear historical example of fascism is Nazi Germany. Much has been written about the Nazis and their horrendous crimes, as well as the timeline of their rise to power. However, almost all of the books one finds on the shelves of Barnes & Noble focus on Hitler's personality, the aesthetics of the Nazi Party and its propaganda, or other trivial matters that do not get to the essence of what took place. In order to really understand the nature of Nazism, one must understand its economic roots. The nature of fascism is best explored in Hitler's Banker, a biography of Hitler's economist and primary financial backer, Hjalmar Schacht, written by John Weitz. R. Palm Dutt's book, Fascism and Social Revolution and Dialectical Economics by Lynn Marcus, provides similar analysis. Let's look at the rise of Hitler and the trajectory toward the Second World War from a historical, materialist lens. Following the First World War, Germany had a Marxist uprising. The German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, and the King of Prussia ordered the Navy to make a final suicide mission after peace had been declared on land, and the sailors refused. In response to the ensuing revolt within the military, strikes took place across Germany, and workers' councils declared themselves to be the new governing bodies. Humiliated by defeat and losing control of his own military, the Kaiser abdicated and handed power over to the deputies from the Social Democratic Party, the Independent Social Democratic Party, and their allies who ran the labor unions. The Social Democrats convened an election for delegates who were sent to the city of Weimar, where they composed a new constitution for a democratic republic. The most thorough analysis of fascism and its economic roots ever published is the 1934 book, Fascism and Social Revolution, by British communist leader R. Palm Dutt. Even though the majority of those elected to write the Weimar Constitution called themselves Marxists, the new constitution they composed was a liberal democratic one. Karl Kautsky, Friedrich Ebert, and other social democratic leaders argued that socialism had to be achieved through the democratic process and could not be imposed by revolutionaries amid the crisis. The social democratic leaders feared civil war and further invasion by the Allied powers, and they shared the Western powers' hostility to the recently victorious Bolsheviks in Russia. Some German revolutionaries and labor activists wanted to see full socialism. The province of Bavaria refused to accept the Weimar Constitution and declared the Bavarian Soviet Republic as a briefly existing Marxist regime. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht led an uprising in Berlin with their Spartakusbund, but it was put down. The events of 1918 and 1919 in Germany had the effect of greatly demoralizing the Marxist movement and causing many German workers to look elsewhere for leadership. Hitler's rise a decade later was rooted in this epic betrayal and inability to accept victory on the part of the German socialists. The big moment had come. The military had risen up against the Kaiser. The largest Marxist party in the world had taken the helm of power, and the result was more of the same. The words of Marxist agitators in Germany were cursed from there forward by the utter disappointment of the masses and the failure of the revolutionaries to deliver on their promises, when it seemed the revolution had triumphed. The Social Democrats not only failed to create socialism in Germany, but they employed right-wing soldiers organized into militias called the Freikorps to suppress those that refused to accept the Weimar Republic and wanted socialism. Throughout the 1920s, the Freikorps became semi-permanent associations of anti-communist veterans who kept firearms and were used to put down strikes and protests. Germany was stripped of its colonies by the Versailles Treaty at the end of the First World War and barred from having its own military. The German government was obligated to pay reparations to the countries that had been victorious in the war. Throughout the 1920s, the Weimar Republic in Germany was unable to bring stability as unemployment and inflation made life miserable for German workers. The Social Democratic Party accepted war guilt and recognized the Versailles Treaty as legitimate. However, the German Communist Party did not. The communists said that the First World War had been created by big monopolies and capitalists, and making German workers pay reparations to France and Germany was absurd. The Social Democrats' acceptance of war guilt and their insistence on full compliance with the national humiliation of Germany discredited them even further than their inability to take power in 1919. The German Communist Party organized protests among the unemployed, demanding jobs and food. Often these protests escalated to armed revolts, and the German Communist Party formed its own militia, the Red Front Fighters League. Marxist uprisings became more frequent. In most cases, it was the Social Democratic Party's leaders who mobilized to crush uprisings led by the Communist Party. Some German communists argued that because Germany had been stripped of its colonies following the war, and the working class was being forced to pay reparations to the British and French along with the capitalists, that the Communist Party should position itself differently. The group labeled National Bolsheviks argued that Germany should be viewed as an oppressed nation by the Communist International, and much like in China, the communists should strategically position themselves as leaders of a bloc of different classes fighting to liberate the nation from imperialism. However, the Communist International rejected this idea, arguing that despite being stripped of its colonies and having its domestic economy suppressed, Germany was still an imperialist nation. The focus of the German communists was on class against class, and portraying the Social Democrats as social fascists and class traitors who collaborated with the employers against the workers' movement. Increasingly, the Marxist movement in Germany divided into two wings. The Social Democrats became the party of industrial unions, representing the German factory workers who were still employed amid the economic downturn. The Social Democrats passed legislation forcing various German corporations to allow a representative of the labor union to have a seat on the board of directors, arguing that this, not the struggle for political power, represented moving towards socialism. With a representative of the Reformist Union on the board of a profit-centered corporation, democracy was being introduced into the workplace, and the workers were starting to control the means of production. The German Communist Party, on the other hand, became the party of the desperately poor and unemployed. The communists led bread riots, where hungry people smashed store windows and took food to distribute among the working class. Increasingly, the German communists became adventurous and obsessed with violence, and unlike the Social Democrats, who became reformist and focused on the more comfortable industrial workers, the German communists became the party of the lumpen proletariat, associating itself with organized crime and other plagues on the life of the desperately poor whom they organized. With continued instability in the heart of Europe, the British and Americans very much feared the results of the German Communist Party taking power. If the newly formed Soviet Union was to combine its strength with Germany, communism would very quickly spread across the European mainland. The result would be the British and the Americans would be locked out of Europe's heartland and lose control of the world. This geopolitical scenario had long been openly feared by British and American strategists, even before communism became a factor. The British had long engaged in an intelligence intrigue to destabilize the European mainland and prevent it from unifying against them. As instability continued in Germany, British and American intelligence began offering covert support to various anti-communist groupings in Germany. Various right-wing militant groups that preached anti-communism emerged. Many were not only funded by the British and Americans, but also by German factory owners who used them to break strikes. All right, we're going to finish there tonight. Tomorrow we'll do There is no fascist ideology or aesthetic. Put me back on here. Hey, thank you to those 7 people watching. I agree, Edward. He does have my respect, and he's worthy of study. So, hey, you're very welcome, man. Absolutely. We're doing it. Yeah, for sure. Do it, dude. Back it up. Okay, well, let's first put up on here. I'm going to open this up. I need to put this in the description. You want to buy Caleb's book. Maybe you hate the sound of my voice. Where is America Going? Caleb Maupin. You can find it on Amazon that easy. But if that's too much work for you, you can also just click this link right here. I think that's how you do it. That's an ugly link, Amazon. Oh, it don't even fit it all on there. Maybe there's a smaller link. Copy link. Let's see if that'll work. Let's do this one. Yeah, there's a nice little cuddly link there for you. That'll take you to the book. Link to the book. 1-starred link. If you want to join CPI, it's our political organization. Makes you not feel so alone. You can click you can read about it here. You're smart with the internet. You can take the join CPI off and read all about us, but there's the join link there. Put that up. And we'll do real quick. Well, you know how Patreon works. You can find me, you can find Caleb if you want to. But mainly I just want to get that out there. I'm glad to be back here. I'll put all these in a playlist for those that like getting a little extra spice with your audiobook. And I will also go back through and make a nicely cut professional-ish, more professional copy of this. So I'm gonna go get some sleep and cuddle my babies and eat breakfast with a friend in the morning. So I love you all. great to be blah, 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 blah. It's great to be back on YouTube. It's midnight. I need to go to sleep. I can't read or talk. All right. Peace. I'm going to count to 10 because StreamYard will cut this off. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You know what? I need to get better. Hey, thank you, Edward. I will do this. I don't even care. Commies got to get better at promoting themselves. There's no shame in it. As Haas teaches us, we got to be Mr. Krabs about this thing. There's Caleb's Patreon. Just Patreon with Caleb at the end. It's your boy T-Mac. Oh, mine don't look nearly as pretty as his. Oh, well. That's okay. Where'd it go? Here we are. There's Caleb's. There's mine. Also, gotta buy me a coffee if you like that too. It looks like this. See if it's just my first name will work. Will it? I don't know. It does. I actually like their website more than Patreon. It does exactly the same thing. Except you can give just once if you want, or you can become a member, just like Patreon. All right, so there you go. It's enough shameless self-promotion, I think. Star. All right, let's do it one last time. Countdown. Make sure we get it all. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. And we'll be back tomorrow with There is no fascist ideology or aesthetic. I'll read this book for 2 more hours tomorrow, so tune back in, like, subscribe, all that stuff. 4, 3, 2, 1. So I remember where I'm at, right there. Bye, everybody. I love y'all. God bless. Have a great weekend. It's a weekend. Woohoo!